From late 1943, the war on the Eastern Front, like all of War II, entered its final stage. The Allies' victory was certain. It was just a matter of time. The 1944 campaign on the Eastern Front showed Soviet forces' edge over the enemy. Yet there were no easy wins. German generals and officers were skilled. Their army swiftly adapted to a new defensive strategy, and despite the Soviets' significant material and moral edge, they held nearly every line for ages. In 1941, the Germans reached Leningrad, Smolensk, and Kiev in weeks. The Red Army will retrace its steps from these lines to the Soviet border in just under a year, and this year will cost much blood, often avoidable. Russia, Forgotten Years, Eastern Front, Part 3. The Red Army's main task was the quick liberation of all Soviet territory. Bitter from defeats, the Germans acted more brazenly and cruelly. As they left, they looted, burned, and destroyed. Civilians were killed or taken to Germany. Surviving grain elevators, water towers, factories, mines, and power lines exploded. Railway tracks were destroyed so they couldn't be repaired. The Soviet fronts advancing across Ukraine forced the Germans to focus their main forces in the south. Thanks to this, the Red Army Command could strike in the northwest, near Leningrad and Novgorod, and then in the Baltic. The main goal of the 1944 campaign was the liberation of Belarus and reaching the German border, as well as invading the Balkans. On January 14th, the Leningrad Front under General Leonid Govorov and the Volkhov Front under General Kirill Meretskov began advancing on Army Group North, led by Field Marshal Kukla. By the end of February, the Germans had retreated over 200 kilometers. Fearing the Soviet advance towards East Prussia, the German command sends reinforcements to the Baltic. Army Groups South and 𝒂𝒂 must hold the defense with their own forces. The Germans couldn't hold back the advance of the First Ukrainian Front under General Vatutin and the Second Ukrainian Front under General Konev. In January, the Red Army surrounds a large German group near Korsun-Shevchenkovsky. Vatutin's First Ukrainian Front completed the main task. When the encirclement closed, Stalin gave command to Konev, causing a rift with Vatutin. 10 German divisions couldn't break out despite fierce attempts. Regarding the generals' conflict, fate thwarted Stalin's plans this time. 29. In February, Vatutin was fatally wounded by Ukrainian nationalists in an ambush. Stalin, sticking to his tactics, would continue to pit his commanders against each other. In March, the First and Second Ukrainian fronts kept advancing westward. On March 26th, Konev's troops, newly made marshals, reached the Prut River, the USSR-Romania border. The Third Ukrainian Front, under General Rodion Malinovsky, was nearing Odessa. On April the 10th, the city was freed. Two days prior, the Fourth Ukrainian Front under General Fyodor Tolbukhin and the separate coastal army under General Andrei Yeremenko started the operation to free Crimea. The 17th Wehrmacht Army, with 7 Romanian and 5 German divisions, resisted fiercely but were in a dire situation. A month later, the battle for Crimea was almost over. The Germans only held Sevastopol. The key to the city was the fortified Sapun Hill. It was taken by storm on May the 7th. Two days later, the Germans stopped resisting and surrendered Sevastopol. The city, which endured a German siege for many months at the war's start, was freed in 5 days. The enemy lost about 100,000 soldiers in Crimea. On the night of June 6, 1944, the Allies opened a second front and began Operation Overlord. Nearly 1 million soldiers with full arms and gear landed in Normandy, northern France. Military history had never seen an amphibious operation of such scale. It was brilliantly planned and executed. The troops were led by Supreme Commander General Dwight Eisenhower, American Group Commander General Omar Bradley, and British Group Commander Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Among the landing forces was the French division of General Philippe Leclerc. It was this division that would first enter the capital of France, aiding the uprising Parisians. After the Second Front opened, Germany aimed not to win the war, but to buy time. Hoping for a clash within the anti-Hitler coalition and trying to prevent complications with its allies. However, the summer push by the Leningrad and Karelian fronts led to Finnish defeat in Karelia and ended Finland's war involvement. Ships of the Baltic Fleet fully controlled the Gulf of Finland. Soviet minesweepers cleared it of thousands of mines laid by the Germans. The Soviet command could focus all forces on the main 1944 operation, called 𝒖𝒔𝒔𝒊𝒂. The First Baltic and Third Belarusian fronts aimed to split and destroy the German Army Group's center in Belarus. The fronts were led by Generals Ivan Bagramian, Ivan Chernyakhovsky, Georgy Zakharov, and Konstantin Rokossovsky. Marshals Zhukov and Vasilevsky coordinated the actions of the 4 fronts. Two simultaneous strikes were planned on Vitebsk and Bobruisk. Then the advancing forces were to move from the north and south towards Minsk. As a result, the entire central German grouping was encircled. Of course, after the front breakthrough, the Germans could quickly withdraw their troops. However, the Soviet General Staff hoped that Hitler would not allow this move. And that's exactly what happened. On June 23rd, the Red Army began its attack. By the 28th, the Army Group Center Command asked Hitler for permission to retreat, but was refused. Five more days of fighting and Soviet tanks entered Minsk. Hundred thousand Germans were surrounded. After brief resistance, most surrendered. The 7,000 prisoners of war were soon taken to Moscow. On July 17th, they were paraded through the quiet streets of the Soviet capital. They moved in long columns, 20 people abreast, led by their generals. There was hardly any security. Disinfection machines followed behind the columns. And in Minsk, these days, there was a parade of partisan units, which were particularly active in Belarus. They reclaimed large territories behind enemy lines and established their authority there. They diverted significant police and gendarmerie forces, and sometimes even regular army units, conducted daring sabotage operations and gathered important information. Tens of thousands of soldiers and officers who escaped captivity or broke out of encirclement fought in the ranks of the partisans. The catastrophe in Belarus forced the conspirators against Hitler to act. The assassination attempt on the Führer was being prepared since 1943, but it was only carried out on July 20th, 1944. During a conference at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia near Rastenburg, Colonel von Stauffenberg placed a bomb at Hitler's feet. Chance saved Hitler. The plot failed. Its participants were tried and executed. They were hung by their ribs on hooks. Soviet troops kept advancing quickly. In July, they pushed Germans from much of the Baltics, reached East Prussia's border, entered Poland, and neared the Vistula. On the 1st of August 1944, an anti-fascist uprising began in Warsaw. It was organized by the Polish government, based in London during the war, which Stalin didn't see as legitimate. He wasn't informed beforehand about the uprising and chose not to help, deciding instead to punish the independent Poles. Stalin had a plausible pretext. The troops of the First Belarusian Front, stationed behind the Vistula near Warsaw, at that moment lacked the strength to cross the river. They needed rest and reinforcements. Yet the Soviet command could have quickly bolstered the First Belarusian Front with strategic reserves and ordered an advance. But this did not happen. In August and September, Warsaw insurgents fought against the large SS forces gathered in Warsaw. Hundreds of thousands of residents of the Polish capital perished. The pleas for help from the Warsaw residents went unheard by Stalin. The leaders of the Allied countries did not attempt to influence him. 2. October, the uprising was suppressed. Carrying out Hitler's order to level Warsaw, the Nazis barbarically destroyed the city. Meanwhile, Hitler's troops faced a total disaster in the Balkans. On August 20th, the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts began an offensive on the German army group, South Ukraine. In just 2 days, they isolated the 3rd Romanian Army from the Germans. On August 23rd, it surrendered. That day, young King Mihai of Romania summoned Marshal Antonescu and arrested him. A military government took power and declared war on Germany. On August 31st, Soviet troops entered Bucharest without resistance. Stalin awarded King Mihai the Order of Victory, the highest military honor. The Romanian army started fighting against the Germans. The southern Ukraine group tried to retreat through the Carpathians to Hungary. But only 7 divisions broke through the Soviet encirclement. The remaining 11 divisions were destroyed by September 4th. A few days later, Soviet army rifle units entered Bulgarian territory. They met no resistance. Although Bulgaria was an ally of Germany, it never fought against Russia. On September the 9th, Bulgarian communists started a general armed uprising, joined by the Bulgarian army. In Sofia, a government of the Fatherland Front was formed. Bulgaria declared war on Germany. Almost simultaneously, Finland exited the war not only de facto, but also de jure, signing an armistice with the USSR. In October 1944, combat operations beyond the Arctic Circle ended. The Red Army controlled the port of 𝒀𝒆𝒂𝒔𝒊𝒂, located at the 70th latitude. Soon, Soviet troops entered Norwegian territory. This action had more political than military significance. The Norwegian resistance movement received support. In late September, the 3rd Ukrainian Front troops under Fyodor Tolbukhin, recently made a marshal, crossed the Bulgarian-Yugoslav border and joined the Yugoslav People's Liberation Army, commanded by Marshal Josip Broz Tito. Throughout the war, the Yugoslav army was an active force. Fighting it diverted significant German formations. This greatly helped Soviet soldiers in the difficult year of 1942. Now, acting together, Soviet and Yugoslav units pushed towards Belgrade. The battles were fierce. The enemy tried to hold every stronghold. In Belgrade itself, the battle lasted a week. The capital of Yugoslavia was fully liberated on October 20th. Shortly after the Belgrade operation, Soviet troops were transferred to Hungary, where offensive battles had been ongoing since early October. Their goal was to encircle Budapest. Hungary remained Germany's only satellite in the war. Since March 44, it was occupied by German troops. They fiercely resisted the advancing forces. North of Lake Balaton, in the Komano area, the 6th SS Panzer Division, under General Dietrich, delivered several strong counterattacks to the 3rd Ukrainian Front armies. This slowed the Soviet advance to the borders of Austria and Czechoslovakia. Fighting in Hungary continued almost all winter. Budapest was fully liberated only in mid-February 1945. Under Budapest, Stalin once again needlessly sacrificed thousands of his soldiers' lives. Had he ordered a temporary switch to defense, the actions of the 6th German Panzer Army wouldn't have been so effective. But at that moment, no one could oppose Stalin. He decided to end the war as the sole leader of all military operations and abolished the Institute of Front Representatives. Zhukov and Vasilevsky, well aware of the dictator's strategic talents, silently agreed with him. Starting the 1945 campaign, Stalin made another successful maneuver for himself. He appointed Georgy Zhukov as commander of the 1st Belarusian Front, which was to advance on the main direction through Poland to Berlin. Konstantin Rokossovsky, previously commanding the 1st Belarusian, was sent to the less important 2nd Belarusian Front. Rokossovsky was mortally offended not by Stalin, but by Zhukov. Marshal Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front was to begin the offensive alongside the 1st Belarusian. The strength of these groups was about 2 million people. The offensive began on January the 12th, a week and a half earlier than planned. This was due to the Allies' request to ease their difficult situation caused by the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes and the Vosges. Soviet troops were not sufficiently prepared for the offensive. But Stalin didn't care about that. He ordered them forward. Due to bad weather, the advancing forces, on top of everything, were left without air support. And yet, despite everything, Zhukov's troops managed to cross all of Poland and reach German territory in just 17 days. On February the 3rd, 6 armies, including 2 tank armies, crossed the Oder. South of the river, Konev's armies crossed. Less than 50 kilometers remained to Berlin. The Reich's capital was almost defenseless, like Moscow in October 1941. Then the Germans lacked the strength for a quick, decisive strike. Now the Soviet command had all the opportunities to take Berlin. But it was not advantageous for Stalin to end the war in February. The conference of the 3 powers in Crimea was about to begin. Stalin could count on concessions from the Allies only as long as Germany continued to resist. The Soviet commander ordered a halt to the advance on Berlin and to move north into Pomerania. Simultaneously with the advance in Poland, Soviet forces conducted a major operation in East Prussia. The Second Belarusian Front, now under Konstantin Rokossovsky, and the Third Belarusian Front, under General Ivan Chernyakhovsky, operated under extremely difficult conditions. The enemy was well prepared for defense. The advance was slow, interspersed with successful German counterattacks. By 9th of February, the East Prussian German group was split, but not destroyed as planned by the High Command. After moving the Second Belarusian Front west to eastern Pomerania, the High Command ordered Chernyakhovsky to finish off the East Prussian group with just the Third Belarusian Front by 25th of February. The enemy resisted desperately and skillfully. The advance was complicated by the spring thaw. The command's task was not achieved again. On the 15th of February, twice hero of the Soviet Union, 38-year-old Ivan Chernyakhovsky was fatally wounded while moving between units. He was replaced by Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, unexpectedly removed by Stalin from his posts as Chief of the General Staff and First Deputy People's Commissar of Defense. The fighting continued for another 2 months. Many Soviet units lost half of their personnel. The storming of the fortress city of Königsberg demanded the greatest sacrifices. Only a few days remained until Germany's surrender. The storm, with huge losses on both sides, could have been avoided. From 4 to 11th February 1945, the Yalta Conference of the leaders of the three Allied powers took place. It ended with a diplomatic victory for Stalin, as in Tehran. It confirmed his control over territories occupied by Soviet forces. East Prussia disappeared from the European map, divided between the USSR and Poland. As for Poland, Stalin effectively ensured the establishment of a pro-Soviet regime there. In exchange for promising to fight against Japan, the USSR received South Sakhalin, the Kuril Islands, and Port Arthur. Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt agreed to convene the first United Nations Conference on the 25th of April in San Francisco. Franklin Roosevelt could not attend the UN opening ceremony as he died suddenly 2 weeks earlier. By April, Before the start of the Berlin operation, the more than 7 million strong German army had virtually no territory left to defend. After East Prussia and Pomerania, the last pockets of resistance in Hungary and Austria were crushed. 13. April, Soviet soldiers entered Vienna. Allied armies were approaching the Elbe from the west. Any day now, the Germans were expected to surrender in Italy. From Nazi Germany, only a narrow strip of land remained between the Spree and the Elbe. But even in this desperate situation, the Führer demanded resistance to the end. The Nazis mobilized everyone capable of holding a weapon. 16. April, the Berlin operation began. Stalin's initial plan was to storm Berlin with just the 1st Belarusian front under Zhukov's command. He would have received all the glory, but this plan would have led to the senseless death of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers. The new chief of the General Staff, Alexei Antonov, firmly argued to Stalin that Konev's troops should strike Berlin from the flanks. An angry Stalin was forced to concede. Many lives were saved. Antonov soon lost his position and did not receive the rank of marshal. Zhukov's main forces broke through to Berlin head-on through the well-fortified Silo Heights. Konev's troops advanced on the city from the south. Overcoming strong defensive lines, the forward units of both fronts stormed the outskirts of Berlin on the 21st of April. 4 days later, the city was completely encircled. On the same day, 25th of April, a historic meeting of Soviet and American troops took place on the Elbe near the town of Torgau. Ahead lay a 10-day bloody battle on the streets of Berlin. It could still have been prevented. The 4 million strong Berlin, deprived of electricity, water, food, and ammunition, with no hope of help, could not resist for long and would have surrendered on its own. But Stalin and his marshals wanted a battle that would be the war's apotheosis, and the storming of Berlin continued. The Germans stood their ground to the death. Soviet soldiers had long been accustomed to sacrificing their lives for victory. More than 1 million Red Army soldiers were killed or wounded during the Berlin operation. The German side's losses were also great. Tens of thousands were killed or wounded, including many civilians. 2,000 SS men were killed just during the storming of the Reichstag. It began on the morning of 30th of April. On that day, Hitler, who refused to leave Berlin, took his own life in his bunker. Admiral Karl Dönitz, named head of state by Hitler's will, and Joseph Goebbels, who took over power in Berlin as head of the government, proposed to the Soviet side to accept a delegation to discuss surrender terms and cease hostilities. Stalin refused, believing there was nothing to discuss. The surrender had to be unconditional. While the Reichstag was being stormed, the fanatical Goebbels couple, after killing their 6 children, took their own lives. By the end of May 2nd, Berlin's Commandant Weidling, who commanded the city's defense, agreed to unconditional surrender and ordered the soldiers to lay down their arms. Soon, the resistance of the Berlin garrison ceased. The Germans began to surrender. In total, 400,000 German soldiers and officers were captured during the Berlin operation. 5. In May, the residents of Prague, still occupied by the Germans, rose up. The city was on the path of Field Marshal Schorner's group, which was breaking through to the west to surrender to the Americans. Prague was in mortal danger. The first German assault was repelled by the insurgents with the help of General Vlasov's Russian Liberation Army Division. But the Nazi attacks continued. The city was bombed. The Americans proposed to advance their troops and quickly take the right. But Stalin rejected this plan. He wanted to be the liberator of Prague himself. And he became it. For this, Marshal Konev's tank units had to make a difficult march from Berlin. In fierce battles, they broke through the Ore Mountains and reached Prague on May 9th. The residents of the Czech capital enthusiastically welcomed the liberators. The city was saved. Many Soviet soldiers fell in battle even after the war ended. The act of Germany's unconditional surrender was signed twice. The first time, Admiral Dönitz did it in Reims on the night of May 7th. The signing of the surrender on the Western Front was the Germans' last attempt to create a rift in the actions of the anti-Hitler coalition allies. Stalin was furious. He ordered Zhukov to arrange an official surrender ceremony in Berlin. Churchill and Truman did not object and sent their representatives. On the night of May 8th and 9th, in the suburb of Berlin, in the building of the Junker School in Karlshorst, the act of Germany's surrender was signed again and finally. On behalf of the defeated, the act was signed by Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel from the Soviet High Command, Deputy Supreme Commander Georgy Zhukov. The United Kingdom, Chief Marshal of the Air Force Arthur. Tedder from the United States, General Karl Spaatz. From France, General de Lattre de Tassigny. The British and American governments officially announced Germany's surrender on May 8th. Therefore, the world celebrated victory even before the act was signed in Berlin. The The Soviet government announced the end of the war at 2 a.m. on May the 9th. This day is celebrated in Russia as Victory Day. On May the 9th, 1945, for the first time in many years, an unorganized demonstration of spontaneous public celebration took place in the Soviet country. Millions of women, children, and the elderly hoped to soon see the return of those who had gone to the front. Now, troop trains were heading from Europe to the east, home. But not all surviving Red Army soldiers returned to Russia in the summer of 1945. Many were sent directly to the war with Japan. Thousands died in the Far East in battles that lasted about a month. The fate of most former Soviet prisoners of war and repatriates was harsh. For them, 100 filtration camps were urgently created behind the Soviet fronts, each for 10,000 people. Not everyone who ended up there managed to pass the KGB's meticulous checks. And from Nazi captivity, most were sent without delay to the Soviet Gulag. The Wehrmacht soldiers who laid down their arms were also sent east. In total, more than 4 million were captured during the war. The remnants of German units still offered senseless resistance or tried to hide, but the Eastern Front had already ceased to exist. Since 1941, more than 40 million Soviet soldiers went through the battles of the Great Patriotic War. Slightly more than half survived. But then, in May 1945, the joy of victory and the onset of peace was stronger than the bitterness of loss. For the USSR, it was the time of triumph and glory. 10. Soviet marshals and one general were awarded the Order of Victory. In total, 15 commanders were honored with this award during the war, including Dwight Eisenhower and Bernard Montgomery. 24. In June, the final ceremony marking the war's end was held on Red Square. A grand victory parade. The parade was led by Konstantin Rokossovsky and received by 𝒀𝒔𝒊𝒂 Zhukov. This was decided by the Supreme Commander, who crowned himself Generalissimo. Combined regiments of the fronts and fleets marched past Lenin's mausoleum. Soldiers threw 200 banners taken from the Nazi army at the mausoleum's base. The war became the past, history. The war's outcome wasn't decided by Stalin's genius, nor by Soviet commanders' strategic talents. It was decided by the blood of ordinary soldiers who fought for their homeland and won. Scriptwriters Yuri Geller, Alexander Eisenberg. Consultants Nikolai Mitrofanov, Yulia Safonenko, Elena Kolikova. Producers John Dukas, Matthew King Kaufman, Maxim Zolotukhin. Directors Alexander Eisenberg, Matthew King Kaufman. The film uses materials from the Russian State Archive of Film and Photo Documents, the Central Museum of Armed Forces Teleradio Fund, and private collections. Produced by Eastern Light, close-up by Castle Communications. The film is voiced by NTV.